Dear guests, welcome to Acquiring Modernity's Symposium, the Kuwait Pavilion's final event at the International Architecture Exhibition of La Biennale di Venezia. With me tonight are Aisha Sagar from AGI Architects, Sarah Saragoza Suarez, an architect and researcher, Hassan Hayat from Al Jazeera Consultants, and myself, Dalal Joder from PACE. Before we begin our presentations, a short word from our curator, Alia Farid. وقبل أن نبدأ بالمحاضرات كلمة قصيرة من المنظم العام عالية فريد عبدال.
Hi everyone. I feel well special. Thank you for joining us tonight for the final symposium of Acquiring Modernity. It is formally like the final symposium under this name, but I hope the start of many more projects involving the current research team and maybe a larger research team. Before our presenters talk tonight, I'm going to show you some slides of what our exhibition looked like in Venice, and talk to you a little bit about the overarching theme of last year's International Architecture Exhibition, and how we responded to that theme. Some of you may already know this because I see a lot of faces that were in Venice and that were also present for our conference meeting that happened in May of 2014. So the 2014 International Architecture Exhibition was curated by the international curator, the Venice Biennale curator Ram Koolhaas this year. And he asked all of the participating nations to respond to a theme that he chose, and that theme was absorbing modernity. And so he asked the different participating nations to investigate how modernity affected local cultures all over the world. And so in response to that theme, we began by trying to understand what the indicators of modernity were in Kuwait, ideologically and formally. And so we decided to focus our participation on the establishment of the Kuwait National Museum. The Kuwait National Museum as an institution sort of represents the arrival of modernity, right? And so this is a ground floor plan of the Kuwait National Museum in 1957, which was established in the historical palace of Sheikh Khazal. And as you'll notice from the floor plan, its objective was very pedagogical, and it served sort of an educational mission. In 1960, an international and open call was announced for the design of a larger, more modern museum. And that same year, the French architect Michel Bouchard, who is developing a lot of work in the region, won the competition with his design of the current Kuwait National Museum. I don't know why the next slide's poking up, but that's fine. So a lot of you have our publication, and you'll notice the front cover of our publication is the same drawing, which illustrates the architect's programming for the museum. It's a very vague program because at the time, I don't think anyone was sure of what would be exhibited in the museum. And so what the architect did was suggest themes that could for people to later populate the museum, right? And so you notice that building number 1 is the administration and cultural section, which Dana Joder elaborates on in an essay in our publication, and successively. So building number 2 is Land of Kuwait. Building number 3 is Man of Kuwait. Building number 4 is Kuwait of Today and Tomorrow. And each of our researchers in the publication team try and make sense of these headlines and give meaning to the buildings. And then the 5th building, which is the planetarium building of the Kuwait National Museum, is sort of the anomaly in the architect's design, was used for developing a more creative project within this larger project, and that's a film that's based on a 1929 short story that was published in the magazine Al Kuwait, which only ran for 2 years. and I'll try and show a snippet of that film when we finish our presentations. This is a photograph of the Kuwait National Museum, which we found in the archive of Al-Qabas. And so for the pavilion, we based ourselves on these drawings, actual visits to the museum, and it's not the image that's supposed to go there. This is reflecting strangely. No, it's missing an image. That one. How do I get to that one? So yeah, so this is what the pavilion space looked like, and it's sort of a stage for elaborating on this idea of acquiring modernity. Acquiring modernity, I mean, while we focus on the Kuwait National Museum for our pavilion, is a much broader investigation that tries to question how imported form affects our perception of our landscape, right? And how it affects also a culture of production. And so the pavilion functions as a stage for the film that we shot. In the opening, we also restaged the opening of the Kuwait National Museum in 1983. And the idea was to go back to 1983 and the beginning of the Kuwait National Museum to rethink the programming of the building. I think it's not only the Kuwait National Museum that has this issue, but in Kuwait, I think we're quick to try and change things, the physical appearance of things, when buildings don't work, when what in fact is needed is a bit more thinking in terms of programming and administration. So that was the idea with our project, right? To question also the future of heritage in Kuwait. That's another main point. What is the future of heritage in Kuwait? We tend to think that heritage has to do with kind of a pre-oil Kuwait, and a lot of the modernist structures in Kuwait are kind of being overlooked. And so this project aims to kind of update our perception of heritage, our ideas about heritage, and yeah. These are angles of the installation. There's a photograph. Maybe this will do something. Okay. And so parallel to our pavilion, we also did a joint installation with the Nordic Pavilion. And for those of you who don't know how the Venice Biennial is set up, there's two main venues where the exhibitions take place. There's the Arsenale, and then there's the Giardini, the gardens of the city of Venice. And in the Giardini, countries with permanent representation participate. Countries with permanent pavilions have their exhibitions. And then in the Arsenale, countries who are renting spaces and are participating on and off, or maybe once, or participate in the Arsenale. And so this dichotomy between official and unofficial representation was something that we were interested in kind of diminishing. And so we proposed doing a joint installation with the Nordic Pavilion about a piece of architecture that had been imported to Kuwait in the 70s. Another main indicator of the arrival of modernity. The Kuwait Water Towers is a utilitarian kind of system that also symbolizes the arrival of modernity. So what we did is we installed a drinking fountain in the shape of water towers and returned to the Nordic Pavilion a piece of architecture, but how it was interpreted locally. And these are photographs of people using the drinking fountain. It was an absolute hit. I don't understand why this is doing this, I'm sorry. I want to show the photograph of. And so the exhibition this year lasted 6 months. It normally lasts only 3. And so the Kuwait Pavilion installation and the drinking fountain were just taken down. But we just heard news from our contractor that the drinking fountain has been adopted by the city, a nearby city of Treviso. They're building a public park, and somehow found out about the drinking fountain, and so now the drinking fountain has a permanent home in Italy. And I'll conclude my presentation with that, because you guys are going to elaborate on these subjects, and then maybe show a snippet of the film later. Thank you. So this is a rough cut of the movie that we're working on, and at the moment we're still figuring out where we're going. This aspect of our project was funded by the United Real Estate Company. The rest of it by the National Council for Culture, Arts and Letters. They're the commissioning organization of our participation in the biennial. And the Ministry of Youth Affairs of the state of Kuwait supported all of the researchers' travels and accommodation in Venice. So the film was meant as something that came back from our participation in Venice. For those who didn't get to attend the exhibition, it's kind of a way of relaying the image. And so, like I said, it's based on a short story by Khalid al-Faraj, written in 1929. And the idea is as well to try and activate all of these, well, in this case, activate a text, but in the project, the idea is to kind of pick up where some projects were left abandoned, right? So this is Maysa al-Mu'min. She's a researcher in one of our projects. In the film, it's all, there she is. It's all non-actors, and so everyone who formed part of our research team is featured in the film somewhere, and everyone around us. We've got Italians participating there as well, and so yeah, it's sort of a compilation of things. I'm going to skim through this quickly. The idea is that you get a glimpse of Kuwait before she takes off and leaves to Venice.
نبي بنفسر هالقصة القديمة بالحاضر عشان نساعد هالشيء. نبي نغير المشهد شوي. هذه قصة منيرة. جبلة أي مكان بجبلة لو سمحت. هذه القوة المجهولة الرهيبة بين ذرات المغناطيس تجذب المعادن لها بشتى الأنواع والأحجام.
مثل جمال عودها الشبابية الكامل الأوصاف لما يجذب قلوب وعيون العذارى. منيرة رمز الجمال وتمثاله، لكن الله سبحانه بحكمته ياخذ ويعطي ليتوازن الخلق، والإنسان طاغي بطبعه، فلما يحس بهالنقص رح يتعب. جسمها الرباني يضم قلب ساذج بين ينحانه، وعقل متروس خرافات وتفاهات. ثقتها عمية بكلام العيايز وخدم مثلي، مسرع ما تاخذ بالحكي والطبقة. منيرة حالها من حال اللي حولها، أمية وكسولة وناقصة عقل، تحب تلبس وتكشخ، وفوق كل هذا جمالها الرباني اللي ما له مثيل.
آسف. خلال محاولتي
قاعدة اشتغل على فيلم عن وحدة تآمن بالخرافات وخادماتي بعيال.
منيرة تربت على الحذايات، عن ينان وشياطين ومعجزات الأولياء الصالحين، عن خوارق الزار وعفاريت بني جنسها، مضاعيدها وخلاخيلها عليهم تعاويذ. تلبس سلاسل ومضاعد وحيول أشكال والوان، اللي يحميها من العين واللي يبعد الين والمرض عنها، ومنهم اللي يجيب لها المحبة. كانت كريمة بصفها على ضاحي الخضر وحفلات الزهر. منيرة من وعت على الدنيا وهي من نصيب ويدعمها عبد القادر. هي راضية بقضاء الله وقدره، لا تحبه ولا تكرهه، فهو مفروض عليها كزوج مثل ما فرض عليها اسمها منيرة. جمالها الفتان تسلط على عواطف ليلها، كان خاتم بصبعها، انصاع لها ولمطالبها، آلفته لين الألفة صارت مودة، والمودة صارت محبة. انعموا بقطف ثمار المحبة اللي بينهم، كان فيها أمل يملي محياها نور، لكن هالنور تحول ظلام. هذا الحجر يتمنونه فلاسفة العشق والحب.
Okay, so that's a snippet from the film, and later on you see the Kuwait Pavilion. There's a scene inside that takes place inside of that. There's a scene that takes place around the drinking fountain, and the idea was to swap the landscape, right? To shoot Venice for Kuwait, which is a stretch, but we've got a similar relationship to the water, and so in places it works, and it requires a bit of imagination. But I think we managed. We're really excited about the film, and with the project, I think we all kind of explored many things, you know. And so if you'll sign up for the mailing list outside, we can send you the date of the screening. At the moment, we're talking to the Ministry of Youth, the department called الحداثة, about filming it in their upcoming film festival. And that should happen this month in December or early next year. Thanks so much.
So I'm Dan Al-Joder. I'll be introducing my fellow researchers tonight, Aisha, Sara, and Hassan. And we also have a group of 20 other researchers who've helped us in this project, mainly to define an outline for the history of Kuwait in order for us to start researching and digging into the material that we have. So for this year's Venice Biennial, Rem Koolhaas indicated a time frame in his curatorial statement from 1914 to 2014. That's 100 years of modernity in Europe. But in Kuwait, we know that's not the case. Le Corbusier's Domino House was drawn up in 1914, but in Kuwait we were still in the mud house. And it wasn't until 1946 that things start to stir up with the export of oil. This meant that really it all started with the demolition of the third sur in 1957. And with that we demolished the heritage and our old city. And with that we created isolated landscapes for our buildings, in which each of our buildings becomes individual icons. And each of us in our research has picked or certain types of buildings to illustrate different aspects of modernity and how Kuwait has reacted to them. For instance, we have the Kuwait Fund headquarters by TAC on the left-hand side. And then on the right, you see these isolated marketplaces that are only connected through parking. 1980 and 1991 was a really strong decade that influenced and halted the development of Kuwait. You had the stock market crash in 1982, and with that ended the golden period. We have the Iranian Revolution and the invasion of Kuwait. And so here I have picked out a very informative image that shows the development of, or the increase of building that happened in the 60s and 70s within 10 years. This is only related to PACE projects, by the way, because I have access to this archive. From 1968, 1979, we have 460 projects. That's double the decade that came after, which was from 1980, 1989, when things went drastically slower and almost completely came to a halt during the recovery after the Gulf War, where most of the architectural work was looking at renovating damaged buildings and assessing damage costs, etc. And then, of course, we have, this struggle we were trying to fight with this post-traumatic anxiety that we came out of with the disillusionment of war, and so therefore came the Liberation Tower. And it wasn't until 2003, ironically or coincidentally, with the fall of Saddam, that things really start to hit in Kuwait. So we've got the increase of personal investments, the rise of towers, something that really started to change the skyline. And in this date, 2014, on the 100th year of modernity in Europe, we saw that there was a repetition of projects that was happening in Kuwait. So things that were happening in the golden era, things like the green belt that was supposed to be developed from the master plan, things like Kuwait University, which was actually quite developed at that time, then the airport as well, and the National Museum. All these programs are coming out again in this year and this time. So why has this happened, and why are we repeating ourselves for different reasons, or because the past structures have not satisfied our thirst? So onto the research specific to this theme of forensic architecture, because as a researcher, and as I think a lot of you here are architects and you know this, when you come to look for information on a building, it's quite difficult to locate one source. And so it became very detective-like for us to extrapolate the information. You have to trace the picture to a story of someone who told you about where to find it, and possibly within this archive and not in that archive, and it's not really related, and you really have to you're almost in circles looking for certain types of information. And while we were trying to look for the Kuwait Towers plan and sections, we were told they were in a warehouse in Sabhan, and it was the key to that place was with a guard that nobody really had this number, and it was just a really painstaking process. Now, fortunately for us, there are some archives that are quite developed that were able to help kind of sponsor this project through their work and their organization. We have the PACE archives, we have Al-Qabas and the KOC archives, and the Kuwait National Museum archives as well. So this here is from my exploration with the PACE archives, personally because I work there, and so I stumble upon these items almost on a daily basis. But I was so happy to stumble upon these pictures of the old PACE office that had almost cataloged the way they worked, down to the request for information they had on every project. So it made finding information a lot easier. And you'd bump into these projects that you kind of forgot about, like the Ahli Bank of Kuwait, the old headquarters, which you don't hear about anymore, but it's got this beautiful screen on the ground floor. Or the Freya Auto Stadium that never got built, which is quite exciting for architects because it's, wow, Freya Auto actually did a project in Kuwait. What does that mean? And then we have structures like this, which I can't recognize. Do you? I don't know. Maybe you can tell me afterwards or now. And then we came across important structures that were forgotten, like this Souk al-Wataniya from the TAC office. And this came with with binders of information that we thought we had lost, and was able to help out in PhD students' research in MIT, who's doing a lot of the work in TAC in Kuwait. And then this Rifat Shadirji facade, these beautiful photographs that we stumbled upon from 1968 of his Andalus complex, which you know as the Kushari Juha building in Hawali. So now, onto the Central Bank of Kuwait. This is an image from the Qabas archives, which was one of the few places that had the actual images of the original building. The other archives I'd like to thank are the Aga Khan Award for Architecture. Here we have the facade designed by Arne Jacobsen before his death, and this was completed in 1966, which was completed after his death. And then Diesling and Wheatling took over all his construction during that time. Now you see here, it doesn't quite look like the one we have now. Maybe you recognize a dome, but that's about it. Now, what happened in that time in Kuwait was we were importing foreign architects to come build for us because they excelled in one building abroad. So say, Arne Jacobsen was known for the National Bank of Denmark, and so they, asked him to do the central bank, which was, being developed at the same time. And you see there's kind of a similar language between them. On the right, yes, the National Bank of Denmark has this more vertical accentuation, whereas on the left, it's more horizontal with the louvers and aluminum panels. And they almost have the same section, with the atrium stair going right through them. The plan as well is kind of odd how similar they are, because you see on this all got this trapezoidal shape on the front that's almost shaped like a fortress. Except the one in Kuwait is a bit more sensitive to the design, local design. It talks about a fortress which is like the gate of old Kuwait, and then how you enter in to a space that's quite proportional to the human scale, not overly exaggerated, into a courtyard atrium that is skylit. And here you have the example of the National Bank of Denmark. So, in this whole process of forensic architecture, I was able to see that in 1976 the building was completed, but in 1985 there was a new TOR to renovate the building, to change it most drastically. The whole facade has changed, and this is the building that we know now. And these changes continued between 1985 to about 1997. And then it was even more shocking that 5 years later, they called a competition for the new central bank tower, which is a 50-story tower, unlike the 5-story building that they have now. So what kind of instigated this, or why did these drastic changes happen within such a short amount of time? You're talking about almost 3 different buildings. And this has not happened, for the first time in Kuwait. This is something that's been reoccurring. Another example is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which was designed by Arima Piatella. I have to say that the person who would know most about this building is Mr. Thorsten Botz-Bernstein, who's here, and he's actually written a paper about this building, a 90-page, exploration of the actual Rima Piatella design and how celebrated it was in Europe, whereas here it was completely covered up, in something that we considered to be more beautiful. So the Pace archives have helped me kind of extrapolate the information little by little. The reason why it changed, that it went through the first transformation was because the governors needed an extension for his office. He needed a separate gate. He needed a place for his meeting rooms, his office, that was kind of separate from the bank. And you could see the shaded area on the plan below is the existing Arne Jacobsen building, and everything else, including the filled-in slabs, is all built in. Has all been added, newly added in. So, first of all, you see this it's subjective whether it's beautiful or not. Actually, a lot of people didn't like this building, and the reason why they didn't like it was because it didn't have enough sunlight. And it is quite dark. And they considered it to be unfinished because they were not, well, we'll get to that in a bit. Okay, so basically what happened, the changes that happened to the interior here is that they covered out the stair with the wall, and they brought the tellers out forth. They also clad the floor and the walls with Carrara marble, and this is not the original paste design. The paste design had granite, which had continued from the exterior in. This had a newly cladded marble because you could see in places where things got tricky, you could see the layers of granite and then the other stone behind it, which were originally specified in the project. And then they've also covered up the stone and the glass with fabric panels, so it does feel really dark. Another thing they've done is that they've covered up this whole atrium with the false ceiling right at the second level. And they've made this a mezzanine with a wooden mashrabiyya, something similar to the region. So this does not look like this anymore. And what you see here on the doors have these kind of Islamic motifs that are very familiar to the region and very comfortable, I think, to the Kuwaitis rather than the very harsh aluminum panels. So here's the original facade. Now in this section you see, in my opinion, it did have enough sunlight. So the fact that they argued that it didn't have enough sunlight was quite, I thought, quite weak, because at the end they still kept the same structure and they just cladded it with a different material. But people were arguing, when we were speaking to people about it, they were arguing that this building was really unfinished and it didn't look complete. And that's their problem with it. And it didn't quite represent the Kuwaiti identity. And I think that was a problem that was happening in the 80s towards the end of this, towards the end of the end of the golden, well, really the end of the golden period. And people were kind of questioning modernity and what it meant. And yeah. And so here you see a scheduling key for each GRC panel that was cladded on the outside, kind of like a very strategic, planned out way to cover up the building because they were embarrassed of it. And finally, when we visited the building, we were looking plan by plan as to what could remain, because the louvers were all removed and the floors were all filled in. And we thought, well, there was that beautiful brass chandelier that was hanging from the skylight. So we thought for sure either there would be some remnant of that or there would be some remnant of the skylight. And to our disappointment, when we went to the 5th floor, all we saw were the clerestories and none of this exists. What they do have is in the banking hall, they've replicated something similar to the original brass chandelier and have it hung from right under the mezzanine layer, which doesn't quite give the same effect. So now that we're looking at this new central bank, behind it we see, the even newer central bank, which should be finished in the next coming years, which is about 50 stories tall, designed by HOK in association with PACE. And it's funny to see how within a few years difference, the programming could change so drastically with the client, that you go from an office being 5 floors to covering up the atrium, which was only about 145 square meters, to gain 4 or 5 floors, 4 or 5 offices per floor, to an extension and a whole renovation of the building, and then to a whole new tower, which was, just almost 5 times the size, or 10 times the size. That was always quite perplexing. And, I'm trying to get into the mind of the client and understand that. However, I think in many cases, as Kuwaitis seeking foreign consultants, we're not sure what it is we want, and we want to be informed of what it is that we should do, or how to design, or how to dress. This here is an article clipping from a German magazine, and the subtitle reads, "Why Work When We Are Rich?" Ghazi Sultan has tried to explain the situation to foreign architects by creating a criteria for design in the region. And one of his statements, he says, "The first is never to expect a clear and complete brief. A 2-page statement of intent for a $50 million project is not unusual, probably because the majority of clients will be building a structure of this type, example, an airport, in the country for the first time. So help the client develop a detailed and realistic brief." So there it is. The client is not sure about what they want, and therefore that's what they're asking for. And there's always this disconnect with the consultant who's also not sure what the client wants. And Ghazi continues again, and he says, "Try not to be overly upset by a client's constantly changing needs and time schedules. This is usually brought on by the very common trial and error management approach used here. Accept it as a basic fact. One must live within harmony." In the long run, however, no criteria will help, he's saying, unless one acquires a thorough understanding of how things are built, and this can only be achieved by constantly visiting sites to learn as much as possible from the contractors and the craftsmen, in whose hands ultimately depends the final outcome of one's efforts. Now, in all fairness, Arne Jacobsen was not, had passed away when this project had finished, and it's quite difficult for these architects almost to work simultaneously in different regions. But then we have to also ask ourselves, what next? Like, what did we learn from these situations? What did we learn from erasing our heritage in order to create something new? Where do we go from here? So I think there needs to be, in my opinion, a reassessment of how the local population needs to be a bit more educated on the process of architecture, the process of design, the process of construction, in order for there to be a bit more harmonious result. And this notion of the architect needs to be developed, and there needs to be a trust and further study of our regional architecture, instead of dismissing it altogether in order to move forward. Otherwise, we're stuck rebuilding and destroying and rebuilding. So yes, so another question I'd like to pose for you is, what do you think should happen to the Central Bank of Kuwait building that exists now? Should it be restored to its original, Arne Jacobsen, or should it be completely changed program? I don't know, it's up for discussion. So I'd like to introduce Aisha Sagur now.
So, land of Kuwait. This was the question that I got, and I think for me, I wanted to explore our natural resources and our infrastructure and understand the relationship of that to our public space. So 100 years ago, like Dana said, the question was from 1914 to 2014. 100 years ago, our economy depended on the sea. Whether we were pearl divers or dhow builders, or we worked in the fishing industry, this was how the city this is the main income that allowed the city to grow over time. And not only that, but it was also our public space. There were places for women to wash clothing, there were places for people recreation, there were places for merchants to gather. It essentially was our public space. And further than that, it also obviously had all sorts of cultural meanings. You know, the women went there to welcome the divers when they came back. There was all sorts of sort of like cultural activities surrounding the seafront. Until now, it's basically kind of embedded that the sea is one way in which we represent ourselves as a people and the way we present ourselves to the world, whether it's because we wear blue in sporting events or it's on our money. And then we always have an emphasis of like, oh, something has to look Kuwaiti. It either has to look like a dhow or it either has to look like a tent. And that's a very common thing, right? And this rendering over here is actually the rendering of the Kuwait Pavilion at the 2015 Expo in Milan. And Kuwait is presenting itself as this, basically displaying the world-class water desalination system that we have. And of course, all of us drive past it every day. Maybe we pass over more than one group of towers, right? And this is, again, just another way that the sea has infiltrated our city. But I don't think any of us really kind of consider the relationship that we have with water today. So just kind of like on a scientific kind of level, what is our relationship to water? And I just put up this quote, which is by Dr. Mohammed al-Rashid, who's the director of KISR, and he talks about how Kuwait has the smallest amount of renewable water sources in the world. Yet at the same time, the way in which we consume water has increased over 10 times from 1970. Now bear in mind, before 1970, we didn't have a modern water supply system. So what does that mean? How do we use and how do we think about water today? Whether it's the way we celebrate by, you know, people using water guns and spraying everywhere, or it's the way we clean our roads with basically hosing down everything, or overwatering existing vegetation. It's kind of crazy because 100 years ago, we were having a water crisis. 100 years ago, Kuwait, actually, the existing water wells were drying. And at that time, the ruler of Kuwait, Sheikh Mubarak, decided to buy a desalination device. It was so bad that he actually bought this device, and it took them 2 years for them to put it together. And they put it together, and the water came out, and they didn't like the taste of the water, and they sold it. And so they had to find another means to bring water into the city because the city was having a hard time. There wasn't raining enough, and people were not able to store water. So people started moving up to Shatt al-Arab by boats and bringing water down from Shatt al-Arab. And this is basically the way that we ended up we survived until we found Rothtain, which is the largest source of mineral water in Kuwait, which didn't happen until the late 60s. Now, I have to say that up until 1988, there was still a plan that Kuwait was going to have a pipeline that goes all the way to Shatt al-Arab. It was never canceled until after the invasion because people thought this is the only way we can sustain our water supply. So this is the moment that everyone talks about when they talk about Kuwait, right? Which is the moment Ahmed al-Yaber turns the golden wheel and we start exporting oil. But I, in fact, would argue that there's a more important moment that we don't talk about, which is the opening of the desalination plant, and that happens in 1953. So we start getting money from the oil, and one of the first things we do is we want to secure ourselves in terms of water. And it's so important that, in fact, I mean, it's kind of funny because we all kind of grow up with the system, and none of us really kind of consider how important or how amazing this must have been at the time. But there was like a series of commemorative postcards, and they lasted all the way up until the 70s, celebrating the series of desalination plants that were opening in Kuwait. And just to kind of show you how much of a momentous event this was, this is from a lecture by Colonel Amps at the Royal Central Asian Society, and he was there at the opening of the desalination plant when Abdullah Salam officially opened the plant. And he talks about how such an event is a miracle in Kuwait. He talks about how he gives a bottle of water to his Kuwaiti driver, who takes it home back to his wife and takes it down to the market, and they all can't believe that this is actually in fact Kuwaiti water. And they all think that tomorrow it's going to be cloudy and no one will be able to drink it. And I can imagine this woman in front of me saying, "Bachir b'sir shakla khabat." Like I can just kind of like picture her. And the next morning, it's fine, and everything changes after that. But so the other thing that we get out of course, in terms of our built environment from the oil is in fact the the Kuwait Master Plan, which affects our built environment. And two very important things, of course, happen here, which, first of all, is that the people move out of the Sur, which is once considered desert, so people are now living outside. And the other thing is the erasure of public space that happens. Now, of course, as we're building this modern city, which was planned, and this is a picture from 1962, you can see the modern buildings are kind of going up, and you can still see some of the old structures existing. But the thing is like we have a huge water tank in the middle of Safat Square, which used to be our biggest public space in the city. So at this point, the Ministry of Electricity and Water decides that we can't be a modern city if we don't have a modern supply system. And so they commissioned VBB from Sweden to design the system. And at that point, we have 2 desalination plants, and this is their basic plan of how the water comes in and how it's treated and how it basically moves from zone to zone. So VBB designed this modern system, which we've all kind of grown up with, and it's become sort of part of our national identity. The chief architect for the scheme is Sunil Lundström, and he comes up with this idea of a series of mushroom towers. There's sort of two proportions of them. And I mean, in terms of infrastructure, it's a very simple idea. You know, it works on gravity. It's a cluster of 6 to 9, so you can connect them, and connect them in different ways. But I think what's most amazing to me about the system is, like, if you look in plan, the way they can sort of like group them together in different ways. And that was because they realized that they need to bring public space back to the city. And what a great way of having public space underneath these towers. So again, public space is connected to our water. But the unfortunate thing that kind of didn't happen is that even though VB actually designed the landscape under the towers and planned for it to open, that never really happened. This only happened in one place, and this is the park in Adelia, which I don't know how many people have been there. But even then, if you go, you'll see that it's fenced off and you can't access them. But if you look closely, you'll see that there's concrete benches. These are all by design. And it's kind of amazing that you can think that you could actually, wouldn't it be amazing for us to just walk and spend time underneath these towers? I mean, it creates beautiful shading, and that's probably one of the most important things you need in this climate. And when you look up from below, it's just, I don't know, it's pretty fantastic. Now the thing is we started with 6 zones, and over time we start to increase as the city has grown up over time, and they essentially become like infrastructural oases that essentially make the desert bloom in a way. And so this is where kind of like most of our built environment in a way rests. But you can see that there's some areas that are new, and the mushroom towers are coming up because that's the next area that's going to be built, whether it's Sabah al-Ahmed City or Jabal al-Ahmed City. There's a neighborhood or there's something that will come up, and the first part of infrastructure that has to go is the water. Now the other thing I want to talk about which is probably the only difference in the network, which is the Kuwait Towers. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, but this was a pretty amazing find for us, which was the original 10 options for what the Kuwait Tower could be. And the interesting thing about all of this is if you look at all of them, they're all, except for the actual one that became the Kuwait Tower, they're all basically variations on the Mushroom Tower. And there's a very simple reason, because when VBB were asked to put a different design, they asked that Kuwait wanted an icon because this was on the water, and they thought it should look different and it should represent the country in a way. They couldn't, they were in a rut, and it was Sunil Lundström's wife, Melambur, who herself was a designer. She sketched something and she gave it to her husband, and they kept modeling it, and it kept going in. And finally, they took the 10, they narrowed them down to 3, and out of the 3, it was the tower that she designed that was ultimately selected. Now, of course, the Kuwait Tower opens up in 1976 with the complete system. It becomes the symbol of Kuwait, as we all know it. But we all know, as I'm sure a lot of you know, it's been closed for a while. And I don't know is it still the symbol of our country? Do we still feel civic pride in sort of what was constructed? I ask this because just like randomly, I did a Google search last night and just put in like Kuwait City and Kuwait skyline. And 1 out of every 8 images included the towers. Everything else included some kind of generic image like this, which I think could look anywhere in the world. And it's funny because I remember when Hamra first opened, I read an article, and in the article it said, Hamra will now be the symbol of Kuwait, it will no longer be Kuwait Towers. And it's a question that I like to pose because it's like, is that the way we see ourselves as a nation? Do we see ourselves, do we take pride in our civic institutions or not? And so what's going to happen to the towers? They're not being used right now. They're supposedly under renovation. They've been closed since 2012. It's going to be 2015. I don't know if anyone in this room knows, but I would be happy if anyone knows when they're going to open. But let's get back to sort of kind of the point discussion about public space. So when the modern city was designed, like I said, public space was erased, and a huge part of it was our relationship with the waterfront. We had Gulf Road, and then there was a big gap, and so luckily for us, Ghazi Sultan in 1978, along with KO and Sasaki, decided to offer a master plan for the waterfront, and as a way of giving back the water back to the public for us to enjoy. And so they literally zoned everything from Shueikh Port all the way to Ras Al Ad, which if you think about is the same amount of public space we have right now. That essentially hasn't changed in 40 years. And sort of the crown jewel, let's say, of this development was supposed to be Green Island. And this is one of Ghazi's amazing sketches of the project. Of course, the whole waterfront, the 21-kilometer development, opened in 1988, almost right before the invasion. And here, if we could, I'm sure a lot of people used to go there maybe as kids, or not, maybe have fond memories there. But you can see there's two restaurants, there's a watchtower, there's a geodesic dome, there's a ziggurat. There's more than one component. And the interesting thing about this place, I visited it a lot in the past year, and there's some things that even maybe I don't remember from my time there as a child, which is like how certain things were scaled for a child to play in and a child to enjoy. And it's actually one of the most amazing spaces I think that we have in Kuwait. That being said, a couple of years ago, the land of Green Island was designated as a future BOT project. And the idea is let's build a 5-star hotel here. And let's build this. And I mean, I don't know about you guys, but for me, like, this is one of the most amazing spaces we have in the city. And this is public space. Why should it be privatized and become a hotel that's inaccessible to most of us? I don't think that's fair, and I don't think that's right, but that's my opinion. I mean, luckily for us, it's been in the courts for a while, and so it seems like it may not happen, but it's problematic that it's even considered an idea and it's even considered an option. But so I just took some pictures just to show you kind of the state that it's in, because it's actually very good, but a lot of people don't go there. I'm sure there are people here with kids. Do any of you go to Green Island anymore? Yes? Okay, 2 people. 3 people. That's great. I've been there, but I don't have kids. So anyway, but you can see that there's some changes that have happened. For example, like they changed the amphitheater, the open-air amphitheater. Like, Watan TV came over and they decided to use it as a stage and put this disgusting black marble, which is terrible because if you look at the concrete that was used in Green Island, you can't tell if it's dusty. But with this black marble, you go there and it's like, you can see that it's unclean and it's not well kept. Again, like that building on the right is the one it's a stairwell that's designed for kids. And if like, I can barely walk in there and I'm not very tall, so, but it's an amazing space that if the problem is with Green Island was that people were not going, then the question is maybe it's a question of programming or maybe it's a question of management. I don't think the question should be let's tear it down and build a hotel. And I think that's something that we do a lot in Kuwait. We don't necessarily ask the right question. We automatically go and try to replace it. There's a restaurant that just opened up in front of it, an Asian place. And people are going there, but the 2 restaurants inside here are empty. There's no reason why they should be empty. You know what I mean? I think if we ask the right questions, we can figure out what the root of the problem is. And again, these are just views just to show you the current condition with the original condition. And it really is in, pretty good shape. There are things that you could do to make it better, of course. You could add more trees, you could change the vegetation, all of that will have an effect. But erasing all of this land, and it was a project that cost 50 million in 1970. Is that fair to just say, okay, we'll just throw all of that 50 million down the drain and to build a 5-star hotel? Now, this is also very important because if we look at the entire coastline of Kuwait, which is around just over 300 kilometers, I mean, not all of it is accessible. If we think from Doha up, most of that either is pollution or there's either security issues with Iraq that don't allow us to use it. And so, in fact, the part that's most accessible, of course, is where we have from Shueikh Port to Ras Al Ard, and that fundamentally hasn't changed. The line in the orange is what I would call the privatized coastlands, which is where all of us spend our weekends at the chalet. It's not really our land. We lease it every year, but all of the buildings we built there are permanent. And is that fair that maybe a third of our coastline, where the best waterfront is not accessible to most of us? That's just a question I'd like to raise. Because the other thing is, our relationship with the water has changed so much, and it's important for everyone now to basically, you can buy whatever you want with your own money, right? And this is just two views of what's happening in Sabah al-Ahmed Sea City. So the view on the left is from 2002, and the view on the right is from 2014. And essentially, if you have enough money, you can buy your own beach. Maybe you couldn't afford one 30 years ago, but you can afford one now. And this will just continue. So this idea that there's nothing for the public, but everything is privatized, will just keep going on because this is the way we're sort of continually growing and consuming. But the thing is, public space is also not just about recreation or having fun. Public space is a place where we're all supposed to have a voice, and as a populace, talk about what we want. And I just wanted to mention here, because Irada Square, or Saht al-Irada, didn't really actually happen until 2006 with the Youth Nabiha Khamsa movement. And the reason I'm mentioning that is this space before, as you can see, really was a non-space. It didn't really exist. There was a need, and the space happened. So we don't have to wait until we need something to actually do something about it. And these issues that I'm talking about relating to infrastructure and the water and the waterfront, these issues are not unique to Kuwait. These happen in cities that are on the water all over the world, whether you're in Toronto or in New York or in Vancouver. We all deal with similar problems, but in different ways. And so we can look at what other people are doing and how they're solving these problems. I think this is one of the most amazing images I found of our landscape. And if you think this is water, does everyone think this is water? This is oil. This image is from 1991, directly after the burning of the oil wells. And the reason I put this image is because oil, like water, again, is a non-renewable resource, and we're spending it. And like today, I think the price of the barrel, or yesterday, the price of the barrel was 57. It's gone down since what it was before, and we're not really thinking of our future. We're just constantly consuming everything. But I just wanted to end with this quote by Werner Herzog, which is from his sci-fi film that was shot during this time, Lessons of Darkness. And he says, everything that looks like water is in actuality oil. Ponds and lakes are spread out all over the land. The oil is treacherous because it reflects the sky. The oil is trying to disguise itself as water. Thank you.
Since I live in Kuwait, but I'm a foreigner at the end, so I was a little bit afraid to speak about the men of Kuwait. So I went back to the program of the National Museum of Kuwait to see what was the men of Kuwait of those days, and they speak about archaeology, they speak about history, painting, folklore. These were the things to be displayed on the museum. About the boats, reminded the travels. So I thought it's related to the tradition with the heritage. So I start to question, what is the heritage for the men of Kuwait today? And trying to put that on the topic of the Biennale, of the Architecture Biennale. So when the oil was found, and mainly when they start to export oil, it was not only a physical change. So this kind of change happened also in terms of social. So the men of Kuwait, I think, and I can feel it even today, he kept some traditions, but at the same time, he opened, he welcomed the modernity. So as far as I research, he was happy with the modernity. He adapted a new lifestyle that was translated in the international press, as we can see, the fabulous Sheikh Dam, everything's up to date in Kuwait. The postcards of those times were beautiful Kuwait, showing the men of Kuwait on their new buildings, the Kuwait University, the palaces, the new markets. So with that, it came a new city, new buildings, and one of the main structures that appeared on that time, they were the souks, these huge concrete structures that we can still see on the city. And they, for me, they are very interesting because despite their massive presence, like in the brutalist way, they are very open to, they are very humanized. They are very humanized by the expats and also by the men of Kuwait. They have their offices mainly in Souk Al-Manak, and we can see the foreigner community more in the Souk Wataniya or in the Souk Al-Safat. At the same time, like the National Museum of Kuwait, they start to build the new national marks, landmarks of the country. So we have the Sif Palace area buildings of Piatella couple, and we have also, Dana spoke already about the Central Bank, and also the National Assembly. These examples, they are very important, and that blue is parts of my text, because usually when we speak about modernist buildings, usually most of the people, they have a bad reaction. They are in concrete, and mainly they don't respect the place where they were built. They are the same all over the place. And even if you can say that with some architects, it's not true with all of them. So at the same time, there were some kind of architects, like Piatella, for example, the CUP, they were very well known by the organic approach to the modern architecture, so where they were trying to find the local materials and using some elements, like the tiles that they were in Sif Palace, they were inspired in Sadu carpets. We have the door, wall tiles, fountains, the dome of Central Bank, the Mashrabiya, and also in the National Assembly, a very organic building. So, and how the men of Kuwait now treat all these kinds of buildings? It's difficult to explain myself on this matter, but I think it's not in a very good way, since the demolition is the main action towards these kinds of buildings. So the maintenance, it doesn't exist. We never think about maintaining a building, repairing a window. So the attitude is always demolish. And many buildings that I made a survey on my thesis that I did some years ago in Lisbon, in Portugal. I came to Kuwait several times before I came living here, and I take several pictures. And it's incredible how fast the demolition happened. Even today, every time we go to a street, we never know if that street will be the same again tomorrow, because every day there is a demolition happen. That happened now on the top in the area 9. That was an area designed in the 60s by Schieber, with a where it is the textile market, and it's half of the building was demolished, so I don't know what is worse, all demolished or just half of the building, so we can suffer for the rest of our lives. And then after a while, I think this was a shock for many people, mainly for many architects, the Chamber of Commerce, because it was a very strong building. It was not damaged, it was not weak. It had a very strong presence in the city. And I think this demolition was very, I think with that many people wake up for what was happening in the country. Even there was the first public riot in pro of preservation. And then we have several kinds of demolitions that they are not very physical, like turning down, but they change the integrity of the building, like the fountains inside the Sif Palace, which for me is considered a demolition since their integrity disappeared. Also, on the time that I wrote the article for the Biennale in May of this year, I say that the Kuwait National Museum, along with the Kuwaiti Towers, are considered the remaining exceptions. So, till now, they were in a very good stage, and all the small, because the building, of course, it has some changings. But the integrity was still there. But we know on that time that some transformations will happen on the National Museum. About the new project, I cannot say too much things because I really don't know. But what I can say is about what we can see from the road, is the demolition of the bridges that were connecting the 4 blocks, which in my opinion destroys the concept of the program of the National Museum when it was designed. So I'm still waiting for the final building, but on these kinds of preservation, I'm usually more pessimist than optimistic, but let's see. And there we have the Kuwaiti Towers. Me and Aisha, we like the same image, which everything is, it was a really important project, and it is an important construction till today. It was with very good, in newspapers, international press, many expertise said very, very good things on that time and even till today about this project. It was Aga Khan Award in the 80s, 1980, and it was one of the buildings that the Nordic Pavilion took for the Venice Biennale in 82. So, and it's in black and white because it's close, and we are still waiting what will be the future. Maybe it will be colorful, or maybe not. Let's see, let's hope. And this thing of the heritage, we can think that, oh, in Kuwait it doesn't make sense, we are in the Gulf, we are in the Middle East, we are young countries, but I don't think that way, and I think other countries on the Gulf are not thinking that way also at this moment. Even, for example, the pavilion of Bahrain, this year also on the Biennale, they made a publication from the Arab world. And the buildings that they pick from Kuwait, with the original drawings of the architects, were the Kuwait National Assembly, the Kuwaiti Water Towers, Sif Palace additions, and Kuwait National Museum. So it's a way that we can understand all the other neighbors can see Kuwait, the buildings that they picked to represent Kuwait. And also we have the Qatar that now, even a very young country, and we go there and it's like a working place, all the countries, so we don't understand, but still they are trying to make some progress, and they organized this year the World Heritage Committee. Even Abu Dhabi also start with also is making a big effort in preservation. So I think if Kuwait thinks about the towers and the skyscrapers of the other Gulf countries like Dubai, I think now can be also a good option also to start to think about their past and their history and their heritage. Thank you.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. I was looking at the building number 4, Kuwait of Today and Tomorrow. Building number 4 is, well, I started looking at the master plans of Kuwait and narrated how society and the city had adapted to the introduction of all the new master plans as they came, and noticed all the the things that affected Kuwait of today. After the first master plan, where my colleagues talked extensively about this process of demolition and introduction of a new modernity, each new master plan had new ideas for the city, dealing with the factors that they were dealing with at the time. Here you could see in second master plan, which was started in the late 60s and published in 72, that a lot of the city was still existing at the time. These were the housing areas at the time, and they saw all of these as opportunities to demolish and build something new. Later on, in 2005, in the second review of the third master plan, you see other things, areas for potential for future development, proposed beautification scheme, land for prime strategic locations. It seems as though the city was never settled. It was something that everyone had a new idea for and was always pushing a new agenda. In my paper, I also discuss about how informally, at different times, people wanted to express themselves on their buildings. So you found buildings with more Islamic fenestration, and the central bank was a great example that Dana talked about, of how an identity was imposed on a building. And here we are today, this ever-expanding metropolis of people that just seem to grow and grow and grow, and the master plan tries to catch up with them. And while the spirit of building these new residential areas is still happening today, the parts that we had before have often been neglected. There was this transformation where almost overnight, the people that lived in little neighborhoods, formed social networks, were used to that lifestyle, had to adapt to a completely new setting. They had walls between them and their neighbors. They couldn't sleep on the roof anymore. So some people were sleeping on their balconies. There were a lot of nuances of life that were forgotten about, that are obviously still part of everyday life now, but that have happened through practice and ritual, obviously not through an adaptation to a common environment. Here we see the city in its transformation in the early 60s, where Fahd Salam Street is coming up, and then you see all of these houses behind there. It really puts into perspective where we are today now. I mean, this kind of living and working and shopping all happening in the same place ceased to exist almost overnight. And in fact, in the late 60s and early 70s, there were efforts by the municipality and planners to come up with new strategies for the redevelopment of the city, to bring life back into the city, which they found was full of problems. And the Smithsons were one of the 4 or 5 offices that were, sorry, it's been 6 months and a lot of these details go away. But they came and they proposed a solution, and it was a map building that they thought was appropriate for Kuwait. A kind of network of buildings where you can connect internally, externally, and really designed for people to use. Keeping cars out of the conversation for now. And this is something that we haven't seen since then. And their ideas were great. You'd have these gallerias, they called them, which is, I think, an adaptation of the Farij. These long, narrow pathways that were lit very minimally, with large expanses. Here, this is the ground floor. You'll see the shaded bits are the buildings, and then all of this outside space with palm trees in the shaded space. It was really conditioned for a nice, habitable environment all year round. And in the city now, you will find some places where this does happen. You can go to the ministries complex and be connected between all the internal courtyards, Or you can go to the Blockat, walk from one shopping center to the next. But it kind of works for our environment. Another thing we talked about was oil and its influence on development and urbanity and identity and everything, really. And in the 40s, the oil company, Ahmadi, was developed in this very modern way. And this came before any plans to demolish the city. And so it was an experiment, and I'm sure people learned from that. Here is an image from the late 60s where we see this infrastructure of oil really happening. And here it is on, at a port. And it confuses that relationship between the land and the water with something new, something industrial. At a different time, oil had a completely different effect on Kuwait. It was rampant, and its environmental consequences are still felt today and still haven't been fully remediated. So this is something that we really need to think about. And as a fun exercise, as researchers, we went through the exercise of really thinking of what is it? What is it about oil that we can look at? Why would we look at it? And we adapted a lot of its qualities to architecture, to the city, looking at how things had changed in the kind of style, or as oil would, in its different ways, and each of its physical characteristics, each of its state of being, whether it's liquid, whether it's solid. This relationship of manufacturing, taking a raw product, oil, and turning it into plastic, is something that is very similar to the process of development in Kuwait. And while we had a lot of fun doing this, it was a great exercise, and it really made us think of things of history in a different way. So, I described Kuwait of today. How do we look at Kuwait of tomorrow? Of course, we can all put our visions, our utopian visions here, with lovely large expanses of grasslands, it seems. All these lovely waterways, and of course no plants, no smoke, no cars. But since I was talking about planning, I'm going to step into the role of a planner for a minute and talk about how a planner would look at Kuwait of tomorrow. What's our population? First thing. This is taken from the United Nations, and they gather this kind of data for every country in the world, so we can compare. And we look at their estimates here. In the good case, good case from a population point of view, not what's best for Kuwait. The population would continue to expand. They call this a J-curve. Eventually, it just keeps on going and keeps on going until something stops it. The low variant here is what you would call in looking at populations as an S-curve, where eventually it starts coming down because of limiting factors that will influence it. So based on those theoretical notions, they have a high and a low estimate for how many people are going to be around in Kuwait. But, sorry, we are, at 2014, we've hit the 4 million mark, and that's higher than these estimates were. And I got this off of their website, which should be current. Another thing to look at are the population pyramids. Why would we look at these? Because we want to think of what the generations are going to be in the future. As you can see, here's the total population for Kuwait as it is, and it gives a good indication of that. Like, obviously, people in the 30 to 40 range are the most, but it's the difference between the Kuwaiti and the non-Kuwaiti populations that are interesting. Here, in the non-Kuwaiti populations, you find a lot of people in this middle sector here, and they're the ones that work. Sorry, and this is 95 and 2005, taken from the Central Statistics database abstract, whatever it's called. Whereas the Kuwaiti one here, you see that it is in fact a pyramid. You have a lot more young people and a lot fewer older people, which is fine for now, because you have a good solid base of young to support the elders later. But what happens if we are not growing at the same rate that we are now? We would face problems such as what China's going through. In 20, 30 years, all those old people have had their one child through that policy. They're going to be around with very few young people supporting them. That's going to be a very interesting situation. So these are things that we have to keep in mind when looking at planning in Kuwait and Kuwait of tomorrow. Obviously, the crude oil index here, this is showing the last 10 years. So as you see, it's been higher, it's been lower, and things like this always go up and down. I mean, everyone's talking about this, the price is going down, but who knows? Maybe in a few months that'll change. Maybe it won't, but at least, we've experienced worse in the past, so I'm pretty sure we can deal with it. Here is Kuwait's situation with subsidies. You'll see this purple line at the top is the amount of money that's paid by the public, and the green and the red that are paid by the government in terms of subsidies. And you'll see over the last, this is up to 2010 that I had the data, but there was a significant increase in price of water and energy. And the citizen didn't pay anything different. It continued the same. And here you'll see, this is about Kuwait, that most of our energy and most of our water are used by individuals in their homes. So something here indicates that if we want to do something about this, we're going to have to do something, all of us, independently. Another thing we should talk about is the marine environment. This also shapes our land. Kuwait today, tomorrow is heavily, like as Aisha mentioned, our relationship with the water is extremely important. But look here, I mean, this purple is the Zubaydi, the grounds where the Zubaydi live and hatch their eggs. The green here are shrimp, and red here is sabur. Now think of all the different development that's going on here. Like there's the bridge, there is dredging that they want to allow ships to come into the port of Bubiyan in the future, once that's operational. This is all affecting the breeding grounds of the fish and the shrimp. And this is something, as people, we rely, if we had no communications with the outside world, one of the only foods we can eat are our marine resources. And those are very, very much affected. So much so that we have such small numbers happening naturally now. Part of these issues are not just from us in Kuwait. There are regional factors. The damming and damming of the rivers Tigris and the Euphrates, the draining of the marshlands, that acted as a buffer. So everything coming down from the rivers would settle there in that very slow water before coming into the Gulf. That didn't happen, so it's all coming and directly coming and influencing our marine environment. Over the last bunch of years, the water level has gone, the floor of the water, of the sea has gone up because of all that sediment coming. It's changed temperatures, it's changed salinities, it's changed a lot of things. And it's something we really have to care about, because it's not going to get better on its own. Which is why, for the Kuwait of tomorrow, I think it should be a sustainable Kuwait. I think there are a lot of things we have to think about, and a lot of things we have to be conscious about in our decisions in dealing with the future. Is Kuwait sustainable? You hear sustainability all the time. Sustainability relates to what my colleagues were talking about earlier. The buildings that we had, the modern buildings of Kuwait. We're easily just getting rid of them and building something shiny and new. But is that sustainable? Is that the way we keep our resources going on for as long as we can? Sustainability is a very generalist point of view. It's a way of looking at things. Here, this is the UN's way of looking at what sustainability is, measuring a place. Is it economically sustainable, ecologically, politically, culturally? They're all equally important, and everything is important in sustainability, the big and the small. Was the first master plan sustainable? It had its notions. It wanted to provide a very pleasant life for its people, living in very comfortable homes, driving to work. Here you see the zones of education and health. Everything was clearly marked. Sounds great for a new idea, but now we drive to all these places. So all of that extra driving means extra burning of fossil fuels, which means that we're directly affecting our environment. There's no more public space. Our public spaces have been these these manufactured spaces that work because they're air conditioned. They have commercial activity. This is what people want. Our chalets, as Aisha talked about, these great fantasies of capitalism. They're because we can, but should we? Should we not care? And planning obviously has to deal with all of these different things. We have to think about vehicles. Do we have pedestrian zones in Kuwait City? No, we don't. It's very difficult to walk from one place to another. Even if we did. In the summer, you wouldn't want to walk there. It's too hot. How do we deal with these conditions to make Kuwait City a place that can be used 24/7, 365? I'm going to talk a bit about office space. Office space is something that we have an abundance in Kuwait. Based on recent findings, over 50% of our office spaces are empty in the city. And what's happening is that you'll find that the government is directly renting those spaces out and expanding their system of employment and life and taking over these places instead of thinking, what will get me the maximum benefit in the long run? How can I benefit people who might have the capabilities to use it now? I've put this chart here just to show that, like, this surge of development happening in 2003 was directly linked to the Iraq situation and the American involvement. Everyone in the region was thinking that money's coming. We're going to build. We're going to grow really fast. We need lots of hotels. In fact, I think there was over 80 hotel licenses offered or submitted in less than 1 year at one point. They didn't all happen, thank God, because I don't think we would have been able to do anything with them. But it's something to think about. Commercial real estate on its own isn't a big thing. People are more interested in residential real estate. That's the big thing that's happening in Kuwait. But we can't neglect what we already have. Here you'll see that despite efforts increasing subsidies to get people to move to the private sector, less and less people are. And you'll see that there isn't really a meaningful relationship between the individual and the non-oil GDP. And this is something we really have to work on. So how do we do that? First, we look at what we already have. These are from our central statistics, and I found them really, really fascinating. What do people do every day? 50% of Kuwaitis, 49.53, are clerks, which means they work in offices. Now, do they have to keep on working where they're working? Could they be moved somewhere else? These are things to consider in the future. Here we have writers, artists, and sociologists. We have over 8,000 of them. Where are they? Where are they writing? What are they doing? How are they recording all of this amazing urban life that we have to analyze it and see how we can remediate in the future? I don't know, but I think these are tremendous pools of resources that, if put in the right place, given the right inspiration, right motivation, can do something. So I'm just going to repeat something that was already said. Do we need more? Can we just use what we already have? Have we gained the maximum value of what we've already invested in? Have we maintained our assets to the best of our ability? Have we protected our environment? And how do we really think and reuse what we already have? And I'm talking about very creative thinking across the board here. You need economic policy reform. You need society to be integrated and willing to produce and work. And they must be rewarded for doing so. And yeah, the opportunities are great. What you could do with all that office space, all those educated Kuwaitis who I would question also in terms of their efficiency. Are they being utilized fully? Is their education, is their experience, is their life being recorded in a way that's going to affect the future? I don't know. Here are some plans for Murghab. I took this picture earlier in Murghab because I found it fascinating. Here you've got all of these empty office buildings and an empty office site. Yet we're in a place that's so crowded, it's difficult to get there. There's potential, but what are the things we need to do? Do we need this new Murghab place? Right now, I don't think so. But in the future, we might. If we took the right steps, if we developed properly, and we established the proper human systems, the financial systems, the social systems, you name it, everything can come together and work according to the master plan. But the master plan has to consider all of these things. It must be a living, dynamic, active master plan that is working on today's data. And this was another example, what we went through in our experience here. We had public-private participation, and we did something meaningful with it. And I would hope that like other people would do the same. Sustainable Kuwait. Thank you.